When I saw my husband flipping through my phone, my heart skipped a beat, not from the fear of being caught, but from the realization of what he would find. The messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I tried to snatch the phone out of his hands, but he swiftly pulled it back and continued reading. I watched his face change with every line, feeling my life crumble within seconds. Yes, he was about to learn the truth. But not all of it. His hands trembled as he turned the pages, and I knew he was about to reach the message that would destroy everything. The one that would explain it all or, perhaps, only complicate things further. My phone suddenly buzzed in his hands, and a new notification appeared. I saw his face pale when he read the sender's name. He froze. Not even a blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a long-standing habit when I'm nervous. My nerves mingled with the terror of realizing what I had done. His breath quickened. I could hear it even from 2 meters away. This was exactly what I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the mistake that changed everything. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it all started. Before I share with you the secret I've been hiding for so long, please, leave a comment about where you're watching this from and answer this question. Have you ever had a secret you tried desperately to keep, but in the end, you just couldn't? I sit here now, looking at the same walls that have witnessed every part of my life. The walls of the house we built together. It's strange, but I've never felt so detached from it all before. The small house in the suburbs, the cozy living room with its worn-out armchairs, the kitchen that smells like familiarity, none of it feels like mine anymore. It's as if I've been walking through a dream, not fully awake, not fully involved. And yet, I know. I know that the moment I let myself fall into this routine, I lost something. Maybe not in the way people think. This isn't about a sudden loss of passion, or about cheating, not at first. It was something else, quieter, more insidious. My life with him, my husband, had turned into something like a lullaby, soft, gentle, but putting me to sleep. I suppose it started innocently enough. It's easy to get lost in the quiet comfort of routine. The phone calls, the bills, the endless discussions about small things, things that should have mattered, but didn't anymore. His name never stirred me, not like it used to. The way he used to hold me close at night, whispering things in my ear, his hands tracing my skin as though I was something precious to him, it's all faded. And I, too, faded with it. I became something I didn't recognize. Someone who no longer felt the fire of living, who accepted the dull warmth of existing. But that's not how it happened. Not really. It wasn't just the absence of affection, the slow silence between us that grew louder over the years. No, I can pinpoint the exact moment things changed for me. It was one of those small, insignificant moments that, in hindsight, meant everything. I had always admired him for his quiet strength, the way he managed everything around us. But he had become a stranger to me, like a distant memory, someone I once knew intimately but now only recognized through the lens of a photograph. I never realized it until it was too late, until I needed something more, something deeper, and I didn't know how to ask for it. It was him who had built our lives, after all. Our house. Our future. He was the solid, steady presence in my life. But what about me? What was left of me when the last trace of that excitement, that passion, was gone? When all I had was a quiet emptiness that echoed back at me from every corner of our home? I remember the first time I saw him, Paul. Paul, the mechanic. Not just any mechanic. He had been my husband's friend for years, and over the past few months, I began to notice things. Small things. Like the way he would smile at me when I handed him the tools he asked for, how his voice always seemed warmer when he addressed me compared to how he spoke to everyone else. At first, I thought it was all in my head, maybe I was just imagining things, projecting my own desires onto him. But the more I saw him, the more I began to recognize something that had been missing in my life. I had convinced myself that nothing would come of it. After all, I was married. I had responsibilities. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was what I had been waiting for. The excitement. The risk. The heat. I'll be honest. There was a day I found myself waiting for him to arrive, even though I told myself it was just for the repairs. I walked past him in the garage, pretending to be busy, but there was a moment when our eyes met. It wasn't anything overt, just a quiet acknowledgement. A recognition of something that neither of us wanted to say aloud. I thought I could ignore it. Push it away. But every time I saw him, every time he smiled, I could feel something stirring inside of me. It was strange to admit it, but I had never felt more alive, more seen. Not in the way my husband used to see me. Not the way Paul looked at me. There was an intensity there, something raw, unfiltered. The first time we spoke outside of the usual mechanic business was in the late afternoon. My husband was still at work, and I was in the kitchen, sorting through some papers. Paul stopped by, just to pick up a wrench. Nothing unusual. But he lingered. And for some reason, I found myself not wanting him to leave. We made small talk. Nothing extraordinary. But the way he leaned against the counter, his eyes meeting mine for just a moment too long, the way his presence filled the space between us, it all became too much to ignore. I was suddenly aware of the space between us, the heat in the room, the way his gaze felt like a touch. He stepped closer, almost imperceptibly. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His hand brushed mine as he reached for the wrench I had placed on the counter. And in that moment, I felt something shift, something I couldn't name, something that hadn't been there for a long time. It wasn't love. It wasn't even desire, at first. It was simply a longing for connection, something more than the silence of my own home. When he left that day, I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the spot where he had been. My fingers tingled where he had brushed against them. It was as if something inside me had awoken, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The truth is, I didn't know what to do with that feeling. I didn't know what it meant or where it would lead. But I knew one thing, I had never felt more alive. And that scared me more than anything. It had been days since I last saw Paul. Every day, I told myself that I was fine, that I could move on and let whatever I felt slip away, like a fleeting moment of warmth on a cold day. But every morning, I woke up to the same dull routine, and every time I stepped into the kitchen, I thought of him. I didn't want to. I shouldn't have. But I couldn't shake the feeling. It lingered in the air like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. It wasn't just the small moments that had begun to haunt me, those fleeting touches or looks exchanged that left my pulse quickening. It was something else, something deeper. A need I hadn't recognized in myself before, a yearning for something more than just the quiet, predictable existence I had built over the years. It was the longing for life, for something that made me feel alive, for something that made me feel seen. It wasn't love, not in the sense I had known it. But it was a kind of recognition, a connection that I had never experienced before. I spent the next few days trying to push the thoughts of Paul from my mind. I focused on my work, on the mundane chores that filled my days. But even then, in the background of my mind, his presence was still there. Every time I caught myself looking out the window at the garage, I could almost see him standing there, working on the car, or fixing something, his hands moving with purpose. I tried to distract myself, to tell myself that it didn't matter, but the more I tried, the more it seemed to consume me. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence between my husband and me growing more pronounced. There was no anger, no argument between us, just a void, a silence that stretched on and on. My husband was always busy, always immersed in his work, his focus elsewhere. I knew he cared for me in his own way, but it wasn't the way I needed. It wasn't enough to fill the emptiness I felt. One afternoon, when I was cleaning out the cabinets in the kitchen, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. I froze, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't stop the rush of anticipation that filled me. I walked to the window and saw him, Paul, standing in front of the garage, his hands on his hips as he surveyed something on the car. For a moment, I hesitated. I should have turned away, gone back to whatever task I had been doing. I shouldn't have cared. But instead, I found myself walking toward the door, my feet moving almost of their own accord. When I opened the door, I didn't know what to say. I hadn't planned for this moment. I had told myself that I would just ignore it, that I could leave things in the past, but it was too late for that. We were already here, and there was no going back. Need some help? I asked, my voice sounding much steadier than I felt. Paul looked up from the car and smiled. It was that same smile, the one that always seemed to make my heart beat a little faster, even though I knew it wasn't anything significant. It was just a smile, just an ordinary gesture. But somehow, it meant so much more. Just checking on a few things, he replied, wiping his hands on a rag before tossing it aside. Your husband asked me to take a look at the engine again. I see, I said, taking a small step closer. I could feel the distance between us narrowing, the tension building with every second. There was an awkward silence between us, one that felt too heavy to ignore, yet neither of us knew how to break it. I should have walked away, gone back inside, but instead, I stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. You're quiet today, he said after a moment, his voice low, almost teasing. Everything all right? I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Yeah. Just thinking. About what? He asked, his tone soft, as if genuinely curious. It wasn't like me to open up to anyone, least of all him. But for some reason, it felt easy with him. Easier than it had been with my husband in a long time. About everything, I said. About how things have changed. His expression softened, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something I hadn't seen before. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us. I could feel his breath on my skin, and despite myself, I felt a shiver run through me. Things don't have to stay the same, he said quietly, almost as if he were talking more to himself than to me. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to pull away, to tell him that this was wrong, that I was married, that I had a life to uphold. But the other part of me, the part that had been buried for so long, wanted to step closer, to see where this might lead. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Instead, I just stood there, looking at him, the distance between us so small now that I could almost feel the electricity in the air. Then, without a word, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from my face. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a wave of warmth through me. My heart began to race, my pulse quickening in my ears. I had told myself 100 times that I wouldn't let this happen, that I wouldn't cross this line. But now, with him standing so close, I wasn't sure I could resist. I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the tension between us thickening. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. Something I had been craving for so long. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. Then, almost as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he leaned in. We kissed. I didn't move. I didn't say anything. I just stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, as the moment stretched on. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not in the way I had imagined it. It was quiet, tentative, and yet, it was enough to make everything I had been feeling in the past few days come rushing to the surface. It wasn't a mistake. Not in the way I had thought it would be. But it was something I couldn't undo. When we pulled apart, there was a moment of silence. Neither of us spoke. We didn't have to. The air between us was heavy with unspoken words, with things left unsaid. And I knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what this meant for me, for my marriage, for the life I had built. But in that brief moment, with his lips against mine, I realized that I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. And now, there was no going back. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and self-recrimination. I woke up each morning with a knot in my stomach, the taste of guilt lingering on the edges of my thoughts. I couldn't stop replaying the moment with Paul in the garage. The brief, heated kiss we shared, the closeness I had never allowed myself to feel before, it was as if it had been a spark in the dark, lighting up everything I had been hiding from. I kept telling myself that it was just a mistake. That it meant nothing. But every time I looked at my husband, I felt the weight of my actions pressing down on me. He didn't know. He couldn't know. I tried to convince myself that it didn't matter, that it wasn't a betrayal, at least not in the way people usually thought of it. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I told myself it was just a fleeting moment. Just a brief escape from the monotony that had overtaken my life. But I couldn't ignore the way my heart raced whenever I thought about Paul, the way my thoughts kept drifting back to him. There was a part of me that wanted more, something I couldn't have in my marriage. And I couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter how much I tried to bury it, I was forever changed by that kiss. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Was it validation? Attention? Something to remind me that I was still capable of feeling, of desiring? I had spent so many years being the quiet, dutiful wife that I had forgotten what it felt like to be wanted, to be seen for who I was beyond the role of a wife and mother. But now, in the aftermath of that kiss, I realized that I wanted more. More than the quiet comfort of my home, more than the passive affection I had grown accustomed to. The problem was, I didn't know how to handle it. I couldn't just walk away from my marriage. I had too much invested in it, too much history, too many years spent building something that seemed unbreakable. But I also couldn't ignore what I had felt in Paul's arms. I couldn't pretend it had been nothing. I spent the next few days trying to act normal, trying to fall back into the rhythm of my life. But it felt like I was moving through a fog, disconnected from everything around me. My husband was still oblivious, as he had always been. He came home every night, ate dinner, watched TV, and went to bed. The silence between us had become a familiar presence, a constant hum in the background of our lives. I knew it wasn't right to keep pretending. But what else could I do? I couldn't face the reality of what I had done. I couldn't deal with the consequences, the potential fallout that might come if anyone ever found out. It wasn't just about my marriage, it was about my entire sense of self. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. One evening, after my husband had gone to bed, I found myself staring out the window, my mind racing. It was a clear night, and the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the neighborhood. I could see the glow from the garage, faint but unmistakable. It was the same garage that had once been a place of work and repair, a place where my husband had spent countless hours tinkering with the car. But now, it felt like something else, a place of secrets, of things hidden in the dark. I couldn't stop myself. I grabbed my jacket and went outside. The cool air hit me like a shock, but I didn't care. I walked across the yard and stood in front of the garage, looking at the door. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for the handle. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but part of me knew I had to go inside. I opened the door slowly, stepping into the dim light of the garage. It smelled like oil and metal, just as it always had. But today, the air felt heavier, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. I didn't see him at first. Paul wasn't there, but his presence lingered in the air, in the tools scattered across the workbench, in the faint imprint of his hands on the surfaces he had touched. I could still remember the way his fingers had brushed against my skin, the warmth of his touch lingering on my body. I walked further into the garage, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was strange, being here without him. The absence of his presence felt more intense than his actual presence had. I reached the workbench and ran my fingers over the tools he had left behind. A wrench, a screwdriver, a rag, mundane objects that had once meant nothing to me. But now, they felt like symbols of something I could never take back. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind spinning with conflicting thoughts. I knew I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't keep hiding, couldn't keep pretending. The guilt was eating away at me, and it wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything that had led to that moment, the loneliness, the yearning, the desire for something more. As I turned to leave, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed to the door, peering through the window. I saw my husband's car, pulling up to the house. He was home. I quickly closed the door, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't know what I was doing anymore, what I was hoping to find. But I knew I couldn't stay here, in this place of uncertainty, for much longer. I had to make a decision, one way or another. The sound of the car door slamming echoed through the garage, and I could hear my husband's footsteps as he walked up to the door. He was home, and with him, the reality of everything I had been avoiding. I turned around and walked back to the house, my heart heavy with the weight of what I had done. The door creaked as I opened it, and I stepped inside, trying to act as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Everything had changed. And I didn't know how to fix it. The next morning arrived without warning. I hadn't slept much the night before, just lay there in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the jagged thoughts running through my mind. My husband had come home late, said nothing more than the usual, and retreated into his corner of the bedroom. His routine never changed, and somehow that consistency made everything harder. His stillness, his predictability, it reminded me just how deeply stuck we were in this life we built, and how far I had drifted from it. I moved through the house like a shadow, making breakfast out of habit, buttering toast I wouldn't eat, pouring coffee I wouldn't finish. He sat across from me at the table, eyes fixed on the newspaper as if the world on those pages mattered more than the person sitting right in front of him. Maybe that was easier, for both of us. We didn't talk. We hadn't talked in any meaningful way for a long time. Conversation between us had become mechanical. What time will you be home? Did you pick up the mail? The car's making a noise again? All substance had been quietly drained from our words over the years. I tried to pretend everything was normal. I smiled when he looked up, answered his small talk, nodded in the right places. But my mind wasn't there. It was somewhere else entirely, locked in that garage, trapped in a moment that I couldn't forget no matter how hard I tried. Later that afternoon, my husband mentioned that Paul would be coming by again to finish up something with the car. The moment he said it, I felt my stomach tighten. I nodded like it meant nothing, as though I hadn't been replaying our last encounter on a loop in my head. I told myself to stay away, to not go near the garage, to not make it worse than it already was. But of course, when I saw him arrive, every resolution I'd made began to dissolve. I stayed inside at first, peeking from behind the curtain like someone spying on their own life. Paul stepped out of his truck, grabbed his tools, and walked toward the garage like he always did. Everything about the moment felt routine, even though nothing about it was anymore. I paced the kitchen, unsure what I was trying to accomplish. Was I avoiding him or waiting for an excuse to walk out there? I told myself it would be harmless, just a quick hello, maybe a few polite words. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going out there for small talk. I was going because I needed to see him again, even if just for a moment. I walked out the back door, carrying a cup of water like it was some kind of ticket to legitimacy. The sunlight was bright, too bright. Everything looked too vivid, like the world was trying to expose me. I paused before I reached the garage, took a breath, and then stepped inside. Paul was bent over the open hood of the car, his hands busy, his back turned to me. The sound of tools clinking against metal echoed in the enclosed space. He didn't see me right away, and I took a second just to look at him, at the familiarity of his stance, the way he moved, the quiet focus in his work. There was something grounding in that, something that made everything else momentarily disappear. When he finally turned and saw me, his face shifted just slightly. It wasn't shock or surprise. It was more like acknowledgement, like he'd known I would come. He wiped his hands on a rag, then leaned back against the workbench. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The silence was heavy, charged with unspoken things. I took a sip of water I didn't need, just to do something with my hands. Then I looked at him. I didn't mean for things to get complicated, I said finally, my voice quiet. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. They usually do. There was no accusation in his voice, no emotion really. Just a fact. I wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. I wanted to ask him what he thought, about me, about us, about what had happened. But the words stayed stuck in my throat. I don't know what I'm doing, I admitted. I don't know why I keep coming back here. Paul's eyes softened, just a little. Maybe because this is the only place you feel like yourself. That struck something in me. I didn't say anything, but I knew he was right. In that garage, away from everything else, I wasn't someone's wife or someone's responsibility. I was just a woman standing in front of a man, confused and vulnerable and trying to hold herself together. I wanted to ask him if he regretted what happened, but I was too afraid of the answer. So instead, I just stood there, the silence growing again between us. Finally, he picked up a tool and turned back to the car. I should finish this up, he said. I nodded, backing away toward the door. I felt like a child caught somewhere she wasn't supposed to be. The shame came rushing in, followed by that same aching emptiness. I walked out of the garage and went back into the house without looking back. Later that evening, as I sat alone in the living room while my husband watched a documentary in the other room, I kept replaying Paul's words in my head. Maybe this really was the only place I felt like myself. But if that was true, what did it say about the rest of my life? About the home I had built, the marriage I had invested so many years into? That night, I lay awake again. I stared at the ceiling, just like the night before. But this time, I wasn't thinking about the kiss. I was thinking about everything else, the spaces in between, the silence, the aching distance I had grown used to. I was thinking about how long I had been pretending, how easy it had been to lose myself. And for the first time, I allowed myself to wonder, if this was the life I had chosen, was I still allowed to change it? That question would follow me for many nights to come. I don't know what I expected when I saw his name on my phone that night. Maybe silence. Maybe a decision finally made, like everything we had drifted into was going to collapse into a quiet nothing. But there it was, his name glowing on the screen, a message so brief it barely took a second to read, "I'm nearby. If you want to talk." My hands trembled slightly as I put the phone down. I stared at it for a while, waiting for it to buzz again. It didn't. He wasn't begging or pushing or even asking for anything. It was just an open door, one I could choose to walk through or close and lock forever. The choice was mine, and somehow, that made it harder. My husband was already asleep in the other room, breathing slow and steady. I listened for a long time, letting the sound of his breath ground me. I wondered, briefly, what he would think if he woke up and found me gone. Would he care? Would he even notice? These weren't fair thoughts, I knew that, but they were the ones I had. I told myself I just needed to clear my head. That talking would help. That whatever was happening between me and Paul had to end, and the only way to do it was face to face. I got dressed quietly, simple clothes that didn't say too much. I didn't do my hair. I didn't put on makeup. I didn't want this to be about attraction or appearances. I needed honesty. He had sent the address. A place I didn't recognize immediately, though it turned out to be just outside town. A gravel lot behind an old and used storefront. When I arrived, he was already there, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. The air was cool, and the sky overhead was dusted with stars. He didn't move at first. Just watched me get out of my car and walk toward him. His expression was unreadable, and that made everything inside me feel louder, my nerves, my doubts, my guilt. I stopped a few feet from him. Neither of us spoke. The silence didn't feel heavy this time. It felt necessary, like everything that needed to be said required a pause before it could be spoken aloud. We stood there like that for a while. No words. Just presence. I looked at him, and he looked back, and there was something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Not desire, not pity. Just understanding. I'm not sure why I'm here, I said quietly, breaking the silence. He nodded, then looked down at the ground, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. Neither am I. There was nothing more to add. No explanation, no justifications. We both knew how messy it was, how wrong it could look from the outside. But we also knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. I walked a little closer, and he didn't stop me. The space between us disappeared slowly, like fog thinning in the morning light. And then, without thinking, without planning, we kissed. We kissed. There was no lead-up, no dramatic music swelling in the background. It was quiet and brief, but it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said. It wasn't an explosion of passion or a moment stolen from a movie. It was a sigh. A whisper of something fragile and human. It wasn't about romance. It was about being seen. Afterward, we stood there in the stillness, not touching, not speaking. Just breathing the same air, the same night. He glanced at me, eyes soft, and said nothing. That silence told me everything. There wasn't a future in this. There wasn't even a plan. There was just now, and the knowledge that it couldn't last. I didn't stay long. I didn't want to. The more time I spent there, the harder it would be to walk away. So I turned, thanked him softly, more with my eyes than my words, and walked back to my car. The drive home was quiet. No music. No calls. Just the sound of tires on asphalt and my thoughts rattling in my chest. When I got back, the house was dark. I moved through the rooms slowly, carefully, like someone breaking into her own life. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. I stood for a long time in the hallway before finally going into the bedroom. My husband was still asleep, curled toward the edge of the bed like he always was. I slid in quietly, careful not to wake him, and lay staring at the ceiling once again. My heart wasn't racing anymore. If anything, I felt strangely calm. Maybe because something had finally been acknowledged. Something real. Not just between me and Paul, but in myself. I had spent so long avoiding the truth, pretending that everything in my life was fine when, in reality, it had been crumbling slowly, piece by piece. This kiss didn't fix anything. It didn't resolve the silence in my marriage or fill the spaces that had been empty for years. But it had cracked something open. And maybe that was what scared me the most, that I couldn't pretend anymore. That even if nothing else ever happened between us, I had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The next morning came too quickly. I went through the motions as I always did: coffee, breakfast, the sound of the TV in the background. My husband seemed normal, the same routine conversation about the weather, the news, the errands he had to run later. I responded as if nothing had happened. As if the night before didn't exist. But something had shifted. I felt it in the way I moved through the kitchen, in the way I caught my reflection in the window and saw someone I didn't fully recognize. Not better or worse. Just different. Like a part of me had returned after being buried for too long. I didn't know what would come next. I wasn't ready for answers. But I knew this: pretending would never be easy again. The kiss was behind me now, but the change it stirred was only beginning. And as I stood washing dishes at the sink, the morning sun filtering in through the curtains, I felt the faintest stirring of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Awareness. Of myself. Of what I'd done. Of what I had yet to do. The garage door was open again that morning, the low hum of the engine spilling faintly into the stillness of the yard. I noticed it while watering the potted plants near the back steps. The usual rusted watering can felt heavier in my hand than normal, though I knew that wasn't true. It was me who had changed. The weight was not metal and water but a lingering ache from the night before. It had been a few days since I last saw Paul, but the memory of our last meeting still clung to me like humidity before a storm, thick, invisible, impossible to shake. I hadn't spoken to him since. Neither of us reached out. The silence was not hostile. It was mutual, as if we had silently agreed that to continue would be to slip further into something we couldn't return from. My husband was home more lately, and I wasn't sure if it was coincidence or instinct. He said work was slow. He said he just needed a break. He didn't say anything else. Not about me. Not about Paul. But there was something unspoken between us now, a charged air I couldn't quite place. A certain pause before he asked me things. A look he gave when I wasn't looking. It wasn't suspicion, not yet, but it was awareness. A subtle shift, like when the temperature in a room changes and you can't tell if it's getting colder or warmer, only that it's not what it was. That day, he asked Paul to come help with something in the garage. I wasn't sure what it was. He mentioned something about belts or hoses. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was coming. Again. And I wasn't ready for that. I didn't want him here. Or maybe I did, and that was the problem. When Paul's truck pulled into the driveway, I watched through the side window without even realizing I'd walked over to it. Old habits returned too quickly. He stepped out, looking exactly the same. Same boots. Same calm posture. Same expression that gave away nothing and everything. He went around the back, and I forced myself away from the window, trying to pretend I was not affected. But my body betrayed me. My hands shook slightly as I rinsed a dish that didn't need rinsing. My breath caught when I heard their voices drift in from the open door. They talked like men do, short sentences, simple terms, practical words. I didn't intend to walk out there. But when my husband came back inside for a beer and casually asked if I could bring out the other wrench from the basement shelf, I didn't hesitate. I should have said no. I should have let him get it himself. But instead, I went. The basement was cool and musty. I grabbed the wrench from the dusty toolbox and held it tightly in my hand like a lifeline. When I reached the garage, both of them were bent over the engine, sleeves rolled up, hands smudged with grease. My husband glanced at me, nodded toward the car, and I handed him the tool. Paul didn't speak. But our eyes met for half a second too long, a moment that should have passed like any other, but didn't. It sat between us like a live wire, untouchable but undeniable. He looked away quickly, but I'd seen it. I knew he had, too. I stayed for just a moment, watching them work, then turned to go. But before I stepped inside, I heard my husband's voice call after me. "Can you grab us 2 more beers?" It was nothing. Just a simple request. But the way he said it, casual, too casual, sent a ripple through me. I nodded, smiled, turned back toward the kitchen, and wondered, was he testing me? I handed them the beers minutes later, careful not to look at Paul again. I kept my face neutral, my voice light, my hand steady. Then I walked back inside and closed the door behind me, the click of the latch louder than it should have been. Later that evening, after Paul left, my husband lingered in the kitchen. He sat at the table longer than usual, swirling the remains of his drink in the glass, staring through the window into the darkness outside. I stayed quiet, clearing dishes, pretending not to notice the silence stretching between us. Finally, he asked, "You ever think about leaving this place?" The question came from nowhere. I stopped wiping the counter and turned slowly. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "I don't know. Just starting fresh. Somewhere else." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The thought had occurred to me, of course. But not in the way he meant it. When I thought about leaving, I thought about leaving this version of myself, not the house. I thought about finding a way to feel something again, not escaping the town. He didn't press the subject. We both let it drift into the quiet again, as if the words had never been spoken. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the look in Paul's eyes, the silence in my husband's voice, the wrench in my hand, the taste of something wrong that I couldn't spit out no matter how many times I told myself to move on. The next morning, I found myself sitting on the back steps, drinking coffee before the sun had fully risen. The grass was damp, the air cool. The kind of morning that makes you feel like everything is still possible. But I knew better. I watched the sky change colors and realized how long it had been since I'd done this, just sit. Just let time pass. I used to love mornings. I used to find peace in the quiet before the day began. Now it just reminded me how much noise I'd let into my life. The garage door was closed that morning. My husband left early. Paul didn't come by. And still, everything felt open, like a question hanging in the air. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I only knew that I was waiting. The days passed in a haze, and I moved through them mechanically. There was a strange detachment I felt, like I was watching myself from the outside, observing my actions without really participating in them. It had become a pattern: wake up, make coffee, perform the tasks of the day, pretend nothing had changed. But everything had changed, and I couldn't pretend anymore. There were moments when I found myself standing still, caught in a memory, lost in a thought. It wasn't the kiss itself that kept me captive, it was everything that had led to it. The years of quiet frustration. The years of asking myself, silently, if I could leave this life behind, if I could walk away from the safety I had built and follow something unknown, something that made me feel alive. But the fear of that unknown was what held me in place. I had always been the one to keep everything together. I had always been the responsible one. I had chosen this life, hadn't I? It wasn't as if my marriage had been terrible, or that my husband wasn't a good man. But something had been missing for so long, I had forgotten what it felt like to be more than just a wife. Paul had reminded me of that. He hadn't done anything overt or reckless. He hadn't promised me anything or even asked for anything. It wasn't about him, not really. It was about me, and the parts of myself I had lost in the years of routine and expectation. I knew I couldn't go on like this, stuck between two worlds, the one I had built and the one that threatened to pull me into it. The guilt gnawed at me every time I looked at my husband, every time I stood in front of the mirror, seeing a reflection of someone I barely recognized. I had become someone I didn't want to be, and no amount of pretending could change that. But there was another part of me, the part that felt alive when I thought about Paul, the part that felt seen, that whispered quietly that I deserved more. That part was harder to silence. It whispered at night when I was alone, reminding me of the desire that still burned inside me. But it wasn't just about desire. It was about freedom. It was about wanting to be something more than I was. And I had no idea how to get there. It was a Friday when the message came. I had been expecting it, or perhaps I had been hoping for it. Either way, when I saw his name on my phone, my heart skipped a beat and my pulse quickened. There was no mistaking the intent behind the message. "I'm at the shop. Thought we could talk." I should have ignored it. I should have put the phone down and gone about my day. But I didn't. I stared at the screen for a moment longer than I should have, my thoughts racing. I was caught. There was no turning back. I knew that meeting him would change everything. I knew I would never be the same afterward. But I couldn't stop myself. I couldn't turn away from what had already begun. I left the house without telling anyone, without even thinking twice. I grabbed my keys and walked out, moving on instinct. The car felt strange beneath me, almost like it wasn't mine, like I was in someone else's life. The engine hummed beneath me, and I let the motion of the car guide me, letting my thoughts scatter with every turn of the wheel. When I arrived, the shop was quiet, the building dark except for the light spilling from a small window. He was there, standing by the door, leaning against the frame as if he had been waiting for me. I couldn't help but notice how much he seemed at ease in his surroundings. This was his world, his comfort zone. And I, for once, was the outsider. He didn't say anything when I walked up to him. He just looked at me, as if waiting for me to speak first. I didn't have any words to offer. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in my mind 1,000 times. Instead, I stood there, close but not touching, and for a moment, we simply shared the space between us. Finally, he spoke. "I've been thinking about this," he said, his voice low and steady. "About you. About everything." I nodded, unsure of what to say. I had been thinking about it too. About us. About the way my life had shifted the moment I had crossed that line. "What are you thinking?" I asked, my voice a little shaky, but it didn't matter. I needed to know what he was feeling, what he wanted from me, from all of this. "I don't know," he replied quietly. "I don't know what's right anymore." I swallowed, the lump in my throat thickening. "Neither do I confessed. I feel lost." The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable, filled with things we both knew but hadn't said. I wanted to reach out to him, to close the distance between us, but I couldn't. I was afraid of what it would mean if I did. I was afraid of what it would mean if I let this continue, if I let myself fall further into something I couldn't control. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said softly, finally breaking the silence. "I never wanted this to happen." He nodded, his eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "I don't either," he replied, his voice rough. "But sometimes, things happen. We don't plan for them. We just end up here." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. My heart was racing, my mind running in 1,000 different directions. "What do we do now?" I asked, the question hanging in the air like a fragile thread between us. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back slightly, his hands stuffed into his pockets, and glanced down at the floor for a moment. When he looked back at me, there was something in his expression, something that made me feel both afraid and hopeful at the same time. "I think we need to figure out what we want," he said slowly. "What we really want. Not just from each other, but from ourselves." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me wanted to take a step forward, to close the distance and make this all go away. But another part of me, some deeper part, knew that this was something I couldn't run from. I couldn't run from the truth anymore. I don't know if I'm ready for that, I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my own confession. I don't know if I'm ready to face everything I've been avoiding. He didn't say anything in response. He just nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the struggle I was facing. And in that moment, I realized that we were both lost in this, caught in something we didn't know how to navigate. Neither of us knew what came next. But the only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't go back. The days after that night were blurred, like the line between what was and what could have been had been smudged out of existence. I woke up each morning with the same question in my mind, what now? But the answer never came. Instead, I moved through the motions of my life like someone on autopilot, performing the familiar tasks without really engaging. It was as if I had been emptied out, hollowed by decisions I hadn't made and a life I couldn't unsee. I hadn't spoken to Paul again. I had been careful, distant. He hadn't reached out either, and part of me was grateful for that. There was a quietness in the space between us, a stillness that gave me some semblance of control. But I knew it wasn't enough. I knew, deep down, that sooner or later I would have to face the choices I had made. And when I did, there would be no going back. I kept thinking about what he had said in the shop that night, that we needed to figure out what we wanted, not just from each other, but from ourselves. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Was it freedom? Was it escape? Was it the simple act of feeling alive again, of not being invisible to myself? Or was it something else, something deeper and more terrifying? The more I thought about it, the more questions emerged, and the more lost I felt. My husband hadn't noticed anything different. Or at least, he hadn't said anything. He still came home every night, still sat down for dinner, still asked about the same things. It was as if nothing had changed. But I could feel the shift in myself, in the way I moved through the world, in the way I looked at him or didn't. It wasn't hatred, or even anger. It was just a kind of indifference, a feeling of being disconnected from the life we had built. One afternoon, when the weight of everything had become too much to bear, I found myself standing in front of the mirror in the bathroom, looking at my reflection. I had been avoiding it for days, but now I couldn't escape it anymore. I looked at the woman in the mirror, the woman I had once known so well, but now couldn't recognize. She seemed foreign to me, like a ghost of who I had been, someone I had left behind in pursuit of something I couldn't name. The woman in the mirror didn't look lost, though. She didn't look regretful or remorseful. She looked tired. But not just physically tired, emotionally exhausted, like she had been carrying something heavy for far too long. And for the first time in ages, I wondered what would happen if I didn't carry it anymore. What would happen if I let go? That night, my husband was out with friends, an impromptu evening out. I didn't mind. The silence that filled the house when he wasn't around was familiar now, almost comforting in its consistency. I made myself something to eat, but I wasn't hungry. I ate anyway, though, because it was something to do. I found myself walking toward the door, almost as if it were a magnet pulling me in. I didn't plan it. It wasn't a decision I had consciously made. But when I reached for the handle, I realized I was heading toward the garage. It wasn't an accident. I knew exactly where I was going, even though I didn't know why. The garage door was slightly open, the dim light inside casting long shadows on the floor. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of oil and metal filling my senses. I wasn't sure if it was the smell or the memory of Paul working here that drew me in, but there was something about the space that felt like it had become a part of me, a place where the weight of everything else could be momentarily forgotten. He was there. He was working on something, his back to me, his movements fluid and practiced. It felt as though time had frozen for a moment, that nothing had changed since the last time we were here together, except that everything had. I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him, not knowing if I should speak or not. It felt like I had come here for a reason, but the reason escaped me. The silence between us was almost louder than any words could have been. Finally, he turned, sensing my presence before he saw me. His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw the same confusion reflected in his gaze that I had been feeling for days. He didn't say anything at first. He just set down the wrench he was holding, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked toward me slowly, as though unsure of what to expect. "I didn't think you'd come back," he said quietly, his voice low. "I didn't either," I replied, feeling the weight of those words more than I should have. "I'm not sure why I'm here," I continued, almost as if speaking the words out loud could make them make sense. "But I couldn't stay away." He didn't answer. He just stood there, a few feet away from me, his expression unreadable. I wanted him to say something, to break the tension, to tell me it was okay, to reassure me that everything would be fine. But he didn't. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the small space between us. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "I know you don't have the answers." "I don't either." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of relief. There was no pressure in his words. No expectation. It was just understanding. "I don't know what I'm doing," I whispered. "I don't know what I want." "Neither do I," he replied, his voice steady. "But maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to figure everything out right now." I didn't know how to respond to that. I didn't know if it was okay, if it was enough. But I did know that, in that moment, I wasn't alone. And for the first time in a long while, that felt like a small kind of peace. We stood there in the quiet of the garage, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator in the corner, the faint rustle of the wind outside. And I realized, with a sinking sense of inevitability, that I had stepped into something I couldn't walk away from. The questions I had been avoiding were finally here, standing in front of me. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew that, no matter what happened, there was no turning back. The life I had known was gone, and the one that awaited me was still a question. And now, the only thing I could do was wait to find out what that answer would be. The following days were nothing like I expected them to be. Everything felt the same, and yet, it was all different. The air in the house was thick with unspoken words, like a secret that had lodged itself in the corners of every room. I couldn't escape it, no matter how much I tried to immerse myself in the mundane tasks of daily life. It followed me everywhere, when I made breakfast, when I watered the plants, when I answered the phone. It was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to break through. My husband, as usual, seemed unaware of the shift in the air. He carried on with his routine, leaving for work in the morning, returning late, watching TV, reading the newspaper. He didn't notice that I had changed. Or if he did, he said nothing. I sometimes wondered if he noticed the same silence that stretched between us, the distance that was no longer hidden but out in the open, for both of us to see. But he said nothing. And maybe that was the most painful part. The emptiness between us wasn't a silence of peace, it was a silence of neglect. We had grown used to it over the years, comfortable in its suffocating grip. But now, I could no longer ignore it. It had become a constant reminder of everything I had been avoiding. It reminded me of the pieces of myself I had buried beneath layers of complacency, things I hadn't dared to confront for fear of what I might find. I still hadn't seen Paul. There were moments when I thought about reaching out to him, but each time, something held me back. Part of me wanted to keep the distance, to pretend that the confusion between us was just a passing thing. But the other part, the part that had started this whole mess, wanted to know more, to understand what had happened between us and where it could lead. But every time I thought about seeing him again, a deep sense of guilt washed over me. What would I even say? How could I face him, knowing what we had done? How could I reconcile the woman I had become with the woman I used to be? The woman who had promised herself that she would never betray anyone, not even herself? One evening, after dinner, I found myself staring out the window, watching the dimming light of the sky fade into darkness. It was a quiet moment, but the silence felt heavy. My husband was in the living room, flicking through channels on the television, his back to me. I sat there for a long time, unmoving, just letting the stillness settle around me. I could feel my heart racing in my chest, the pressure building up again, like I was about to burst. I stood up suddenly, the urge to do something overwhelming. I grabbed my coat and left the house without a word. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to escape, to get away from the walls that were closing in around me. The cold air hit my face as soon as I stepped outside, and I let it wash over me, the sharpness of it clearing the fog in my mind. I didn't have a destination, but somehow, I found myself walking down the street, moving without purpose. My mind was a whirlwind of confusion, but there was one thought that refused to let go: I had to figure this out. I had to understand what I wanted from my life. And no matter how much I wanted to pretend everything was fine, I knew deep down that it wasn't. It hadn't been for a long time. I walked for what felt like hours, not caring where I was going, not caring who saw me. The quiet of the neighborhood felt oppressive, and the emptiness I felt inside was echoed in the silent houses I passed. The world seemed so still, so untouched by anything other than the routine of daily life. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter that calm with the truth that I had been keeping hidden from everyone, including myself. I found myself at the old coffee shop on the corner. It had always been a place of refuge, a quiet spot where I could sit alone and watch the world go by. I walked inside and ordered a coffee, the familiar warmth of the cup in my hands a small comfort. I sat at the window, staring out at the empty streets, my thoughts racing faster than I could keep up with. I hadn't realized how much time had passed until I heard the chime of the door behind me. I looked up, startled, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw who it was. Paul. He stood there for a moment, scanning the room before his eyes met mine. I felt a jolt in my chest, something between fear and relief. He didn't say anything at first, just took a seat across from me, his presence filling the space between us in a way I couldn't ignore. There was no greeting, no pleasantries. We just sat there, staring at each other, the silence stretching longer than it should have. Finally, he spoke. "You've been avoiding me." I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure what to say. The words felt too heavy, too complicated. But I couldn't lie, not anymore. "I know," I said softly. "I just didn't know how to face you." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I get it. I've been avoiding you, too." "I don't know what I'm doing," I admitted, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't know what any of this means." "Neither do I," he said quietly. "But I think we both need to figure it out." I looked down at my coffee, swirling the liquid absently. The weight of his words settled on me, and for the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I didn't have all the answers. I didn't even know where to begin. But sitting here, facing him, I realized something. I wasn't the same person I had been before. And that scared me, but it also gave me the freedom to make a choice. I looked back at him, meeting his gaze. "I don't know what comes next. But I can't keep pretending." He didn't say anything, but the quiet understanding between us was enough. There was no need for more words, no need for explanations. We both knew the road ahead would be messy, full of uncertainties and difficult choices. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't walking that road alone. We sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of everything we hadn't said hanging in the air. And as the night wore on, I realized that, no matter what happened next, I couldn't go back to the life I had before. The pieces had already fallen, and there was no putting them together the way they had been. I didn't know what would happen tomorrow, or the day after. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had finally taken the first step toward finding out. The next few days passed in a blur of uncertainty. Each morning, I woke with the same heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The world outside the window was as ordinary as ever, the sun still rising in the same place, the leaves still falling as the seasons moved forward. But inside me, nothing felt ordinary anymore. I had crossed a line, and that line, once crossed, couldn't be erased or forgotten. There was no going back to what I once had, no pretending that everything was fine. I kept telling myself that I was doing the right thing, that I was facing the truth, but each time I tried to explain it to myself, the reasons seemed hollow. What had changed? What had I really learned? In some ways, it felt like I was standing still, moving forward only in the sense that I was constantly reminded of how much I had to lose. That afternoon, I went for a walk to clear my mind. It was a familiar route, one I had walked countless times before, through the old part of town, past the small houses with their gardens and overgrown fences. But today, everything looked different. The trees seemed older, the streets narrower. It was like I was seeing the world through new eyes, eyes that had been opened to things I hadn't noticed before. Things that had always been there, but had slipped under my radar. I passed by the coffee shop where Paul and I had sat just days ago. I hesitated for a moment, then kept walking. There was something about that place now, something heavy in the air. I could still feel the weight of the conversation we had, the way the words had hung between us, unspoken, unsaid. I had thought I would have clarity by now, that the choice would be clear, but it wasn't. And every step I took felt like it was leading me nowhere. When I returned home, the house was quiet. I went inside and dropped my coat on the couch, moving slowly, almost mechanically. My husband's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't home yet. The house felt like it belonged to someone else, like I was just passing through, waiting for something to change. The phone rang just as I was about to start dinner. I glanced at the caller ID and saw my husband's name. I let it ring for a moment before answering. "Hello?" "Hey," he said, his voice steady. "I'm going to be late tonight. The guys are grabbing drinks after work." I felt a small pang of something. Was it relief? "Okay," I said. "No problem. I'll be home around 8, he continued. "We'll figure out dinner then." I nodded, though he couldn't see me. "All right. I'll make something." We hung up, and I stood there for a moment, staring at the phone in my hand. A small part of me felt guilty for feeling relieved. Why did it feel like I was finally able to breathe when he wasn't home? Why did I feel more free in the absence of his presence? It was a question I had asked myself before, but now it felt sharper, more urgent. It wasn't that I didn't love him, it was that I didn't know who I was anymore. I sat down at the kitchen table, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Paul's words echoed in my mind again. We both need to figure out what we want. The problem was, I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't know how to reconcile the woman I had been with the woman I was becoming. I didn't know if I could even live with the choices I had made, much less be honest about them. The hours seemed to stretch on forever. I busied myself with small tasks around the house, cooking a meal I didn't want to eat, cleaning a kitchen that was already spotless. The silence felt oppressive, like a weight I couldn't shake. Every time I thought about the conversation I had with Paul, the confusion only deepened. He had been right to ask me what I wanted. The problem was, I didn't know how to answer. At 8:30, my husband came home. His coat was off, and he seemed lighter, his step less burdened. But I could tell something was different. There was a quietness to him now, an awareness I hadn't sensed before. He set his keys on the counter and glanced at me. "I was thinking about what we talked about the other day," he said, his voice soft. "About moving." I froze, unsure of how to respond. The conversation we had had that morning, the one where he had asked if I ever thought about leaving, came rushing back. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't know," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Just, lately, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for a change. For both of us. Maybe we need something new." My heart raced, a mixture of emotions flooding me. I hadn't expected this. I hadn't expected him to bring it up again, to voice the same thoughts I had been quietly grappling with. But now that he had, it felt like a crossroads, one I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "Do you want that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his gaze lingering for a moment. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we need to talk about what's next. Not just for me, but for you too. For us." I nodded, unable to find the words. Everything that had been building inside me, everything I had been avoiding, seemed to come crashing down in that moment. The questions, the doubts, the longing for something more, it all became clear. But what was I supposed to do with it? How could I make sense of a life I had built and a life I was about to shatter? I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I stood there, caught in the tension between what I had always known and what I was afraid to acknowledge. My heart told me something had to change, but my mind was terrified of what that change might mean. "We need to figure this out," he said softly, breaking the silence. "Together." And for the first time in what felt like years, I felt a flicker of something like hope. It wasn't the same as the clarity I had been searching for. It wasn't an answer, but it was a start. As we sat down at the table together, I realized that maybe the road ahead wasn't as unclear as I had thought. Maybe, for once, I didn't have to figure everything out alone. Maybe, just maybe, we could face the uncertainty together. And as the night wore on, I realized that, in the end, the only way forward was through the questions, the mess, the silence. There would be no easy answers, no clear path. But for the first time, I wasn't alone in it.